Alright, welcome to my top 25 most dangerous software weaknesses CWE 2020 tier chart video, where I'm going to try and categorize the top 25 CWEs. CWE stands for like common weakness enumeration, which is the technical way to classify computer vulnerabilities. I'm gonna put them in a tier, and this tier has nothing to do with, it doesn't really have anything to do with anything. It's just how good how I don't know why is A tier. Okay, there we go. How I don't know much I like it or something. And I'm gonna try and do them in the order of their top 10-ness, top 25-ness in the actual CWE top 25 most dangerous software weaknesses page. But I didn't put any of the numbers on the actual icons, so that's somewhat difficult. So the first one is improper neutralization of input during web page generation, or cross-site scripting, which is XSS. And everyone knows what XSS is. I both love XSS and I really hate XSS. I think that in a lot of ways it's a problem of build architecture and software architecture convention at this point, because there are good ways of mitigating it, but everybody wants to generate their HTML on the back end. So I'm going to put that in the A tier. The next one is out of bounds write, which God knows what I called that. Let's see. Out of bounds write. I think out of bounds write it's okay. I think you can turn it into something that's really good, but it's annoying to do, so I'm going to put it in C. C tier. Next one is improper input validation. I think this is a fake CWE. I'm putting it in D. I think it's way too general, and essentially you're just describing an information system flaw as a vulnerability category, at which point, like, what are we even discussing, you know? Like, you could just write security vulnerability in here instead of improper input validation. Next is CWE 125 out of bounds read. Where is out of bounds read? Out of bounds read is the same as out of bounds write. No, that's not true. Out of bounds read is like out of bounds write, but worse. So I'm going to put that in the D tier. But I guess you need it for an out of bounds write sometimes. So maybe I'll put that in the C tier and put out of bounds write in the B tier. The next one is improper restriction of operations within the bounds of a memory buffer, CWE 119, otherwise known as a buffer overrun or a buffer overflow. I think buffer overflows are passé. They've been overdone. And I never got to do one when they were cool. So that one's going in the C tier, I think. Yeah. Next is improper neutralization of special elements used in a SQL command, SQL injection, which is CWE 89. I think SQLi is a problem that has been solved 100 times over, and I just wish that languages would have the goal to actually deprecate their APIs properly that do SQL, like raw SQL string manipulation. I think it's ridiculous that this is even a problem in 2020. I'm going to put that one in the D tier because I think it sucks and I hate SQL. And when SQLi is no longer a thing, I won't. Hopefully we can all forget about SQL. Now we have, I don't know what these they're classes. All right. Exposure of sensitive information to an unauthorized actor, CWE 200. which I think I put as information disclosure or information leak. That's right. I think information leaks are pretty cool. I think information leaks are underappreciated, and I think information leaks are a really interesting, very technical area of study that it's very difficult to reason about, and which perhaps in the future will become more abused by bad actors. But at the moment, everybody just wants to buy, you know, your, what is it, Zerodium, like Linux buffer overrun / race condition, and race condition isn't even on this list. Yeah, I think information leaks are cool. I think they're interesting. I think that they make my brain hurt, and I appreciate their existence, and more people should think about them and how good they are. Next one is use after free. I think use after frees are a really interesting kind of like technical sort of vulnerability to exploit, where you're in sort of like an undefined memory region. And so I think use after frees are S tier. I've never exploited a use after free in my life, but one day I hope to do so. Next one is cross-site request forgery, CSRF. I think CSRF is a sad sort of result of the way that the web was originally designed, the somewhat utopian vision of any website can sort of like call any other website. I think as a vulnerability, it's very uninteresting, and I think that it deserves to be more ubiquitously understood than it is for a vulnerability that is as common as it is. But I will say that with modern web systems that use authorization headers, CSRF is not as much of a thing. So I'm going to put that in the C tier. Next one is CWE 78, improper neutralization of special elements used in an OS command or OS command injection, which I've just put as command injection. I think command injection is cool. I think command injection should just die, but I think that it's better than SQLi because usually you're injecting into something like bash, which is just much more exciting than SQL injection. So I'm going to put that in the C tier. Integer overflow or wraparound. This one is like okay for sure. I really feel like B should be okay. So maybe I'll just move these a little bit. Because I don't know, is buffer overflow. I think command injection is okay. So command injection, I think command injection is a solid B. There we go. Yeah, command injection is a solid B tier vulnerability. And where was I? I've lost my place in this list. Yeah, I just did command injection. Oh, integer overflow. Integer overflow or underflow, I think they are okay-ish vulnerabilities. I think that it's an interesting quirk of the way that integers are managed in languages, for sure. I've very rarely seen it used for something meaningful. And I don't think it's a very exciting kind of vulnerability. So I'm going to put that in the C tier. I'm sure there are some really interesting integer overflow / underflow vulnerability chains, but I'm sure that the integer overflow or underflow is not the most interesting part of that vulnerability chain. I have improper limitation of a path name to a restricted directory or path traversal. I think path traversal is good. I'm going to put path traversal. I think path traversal is a solid B. I think that it's interesting that paths are so ubiquitous, and yet there isn't a reasonable specification that really defines what it means to have a safe or an unsafe path component, in the sense that, you know, we have encode URL component, you know, for URL components for URL data. But if I want to have a path, you know, a file that's named ... it's really sort of up in the air as to how that is sort of made safe. I hate that kind of term, but like at least annotated as text in the context of sort of path convention. And so I think that it's an interesting B tier vulnerability right there. Null pointer dereference. I think that's easily D tier. I don't know why this is even on the list. Great, you crashed the program. I think that it's somewhat interesting, you know, that various people have said that having null in programming languages was a mistake. And so JavaScript said, all right, we'll have null and undefined and also unset, which is like undefined, but not quite the same. And most people don't know about it. Oh yeah, and we'll also have nan and all sorts of other constants. It's sort of, I don't think null in and of itself is a construct that is bad. I don't know, I've tried to use box in Rust before, and I think it was okay, but I don't think it fundamentally solves the problem of like, I'm trying to get a thing and I don't necessarily have that thing. Yeah, like null pointer dereference is not an interesting vulnerability. Null itself, I think, is more a programming language design and programming language tooling problem than it is a problem of having the construct of some data that may or may not be potentially accessible at this point in time. So that's, yeah, solid D tier right there. Next I have improper authentication, CWE 287. I think this is a really weird general category, but there's also improper authorization somewhere, and all sorts of other things. I think improper authentication in abstract terms, if you think about like poor implementations of, say, you know, OAuth 2 as an authentication protocol, or misusing other sort of authentication primitives in an attempt to produce an authorization protocol, an authentication protocol from an authorization protocol in general. I think that's an interesting category of vulnerability, one that is personally an interest for the research that I've done. Yeah, I think the category is very, very abstract. And initially that made me think that it was a really dumb kind of category, but I think improper authentication is one of the most interesting types of vulnerability that there are out there. So I'm going to put that in the S tier. Now, I know that sounds crazy considering it's such a vague term, but like improper authentication includes everything from, you know, like sending a cookie that is that has a hash collision with something that's important, to, oh, I sent back a bunch of like OpenID Connect parameters and the users are, you know, keyed on some publicly changeable or like collision sensitive parameter or something like that, to like the abstract problems of like, how do you verify that someone's sitting on that machine and not just that you have like, you know, a delegated contract that said that someone sat at that machine like a week ago or something. I think that's a cool type of vulnerability to have. Next one is 434 unrestricted upload of file with dangerous type. As always, the CWE guys coming up with the absolute worst names for these kind of things. Essentially what this means, you know, is like, it always seems like it's kind of like a code word, right? Like it's essentially what that means is like uploading an SVG, you know, to a CDN or an HTML file, or uploading an exe to someone's CGI bin or something like that. I think that this frames the problem incorrectly, which is to say that like, oh, someone's uploaded a file and the file happens to be bad, I think is a really sort of poor way of looking at the problem overall, because if you try and attempt to work out if a file is bad, you usually end up in sort of halting problem type scenarios where like, oh, this file format is, you know, arbitrarily complex, and so we'd have to have complete knowledge of it and all the systems that process it in order to make sure whether it's good or bad or not. Instead of, you know, determining if the file is good or bad, you should translate the file via copying out specific struct fields to the file formats that you're expecting, and or present the files in a way that doesn't rely on the files being good or bad. For example, you know, using content security policy and iframe sandbox controls to just completely lock down the things that that file can do. If someone can upload a bad exe to your CGI bin, the issue is not you didn't identify that somebody uploaded an exe to your CGI bin. The issue is someone shouldn't be uploading things to your CGI bin. Never mind exes. It's not so much a case of uploading bad files as just having a bad way of place to put those files and treating those files with unnecessary privilege. I'm going to put this in the D tier. But I guess it is quite a common type of no. It's staying in the D tier. No, I'm putting it in the C tier because it does happen relatively often. The next one I have here is incorrect permission assignment for critical resource CWE 732. I don't know why I called that incorrect permission assignment. Oh, I decided that one was Prevesc, because I'm pretty sure that that's my best interpretation of what that means. I think that in general, privilege escalations are somewhat interesting in that, you know, you have some privilege process that does some unsafe process on a non-privileged process. I think that kind of like high-level protocol interweaving between multiple moving components is a really interesting one. Though I will say typically most Prevesks I've seen are very simple things that are just sort of like, oh, this like daemon that nobody has ever heard of, like, reads a file from this place and uses it to, you know, do something sensitive. So I'm gonna say a Prevesk in general is a solid B tier. I don't think it's as bad as bad file upload, but I think it's because I think it has some interest to it in general, and I think it's a valid and complicated problem to solve in general. Next one is null pointer dereference, which I swear I actually already did that one. So now I'm interested in which CWE I managed to miss. Wait, no, am I reading in the wrong place here? Sure, Overflow, Improper Authentication. Oh, no. The next one is incorrect permission assignment for critical resource. Oh, I just did that one, sorry. Improper control of generation of code injection, CWE 94. Code injection, I think, is rather like improper input validation, an incredibly abstracted concept in general, in the sense that code as interpreted as some kind of constructed language that performs an operation of value being injected into a context that it's not supposed to be injected is essentially the entire security industry. Like, that is everything from like lying to somebody to you know, putting a JSON query for your MongoDB backend in the wrong place, or sneaking some like extra flags into Git so that when you get remote code execution when somebody clones it. I think as a concept it's very, very abstracted, but I don't think it's as bad as improper input validation, because I do think that in general, people need to think more about code injection in languages that aren't the typical languages you expect for code injection. You know, like JavaScript for XSS and CWE and, you know, that kind of nonsense, and think about code injection in, you know, things that you don't normally expect, like CSS, or can't think of anything else right now, video streams, things like that. I think that needs to be thought about more, so I'm going to put that in the C tier instead. Now I have insufficiently protected credentials, which I'm put as unprotected credentials. I'm just going to put that like that. It's just a straight D tier. Like I don't even need to explain why that is, but I'll just say that, like, I mean, the fact that, you know, I put the wrong permissions on my file on my hard disk for my credentials is just sort of it's like, yeah, okay, but also it's not like, we're not playing NetHack on a shared, like, university mainframe anymore. It's probably not a big deal if my credentials are, like, in the memory, like okay, it's probably not a big problem if my credentials are a file in a Docker container that's loaded at production time. You know, obviously, ideally, it would be loaded into memory, but, like, I don't think it's a huge deal in general. And yeah, I think that's kind of fine. I think if you stretched it a little bit to, you know, the kind of unprotected credentials that get, like, uploaded to GitHub, then it could be a C, but I don't think that's what's intended here. I think this is just a case of, ooh, you know, you didn't set, like, 0777, you set 077 instead of 007 or whatever on your file, so another user can take a look at it, which is, I'm not excited about that. D tier. Improper privilege management. I swear I just did that one, so we're gonna ignore that one. Oh, I guess I have bad permissions and prevesc in incorrect places. We're just gonna assume they're the same. And, well, I guess there's, like, yeah, I guess there's, like, overtly bad permissions in the sense of, like, oh shit, I made it so that, you know, a regular user could do something. And so maybe that's what that meant previously, and I'll just put that in D tier, because, like, you know, we're not running Minecraft forums anymore. Like, I don't really care. It's not so much that I don't care, but I'm not excited about, oh, I have an operator tier and I gave the operator the ability to be able to do something they shouldn't, and now nobody can post about Minecraft anymore. Uncontrolled resources consumption, which CWE 400, which I called /DOS, which is out of memory or denial of service, because obviously that's a very, I think that's a good description in general, as an overarching concept of, like, you know, running out of memory or somebody, you know, causing you to consume way more resources than is reasonable. I think this category of vulnerability is difficult to test for and also underappreciated. Certainly every time I've tried to say, like, hey, this is not a good idea because this is, you know, allows an attacker to consume unbounded amounts of memory, it's been very much like, well, you know, who cares, right? You know, it's difficult for an attacker to test that. They would have to just keep, you know, doing this thing over and over, or, like, you know, hitting this endpoint over and over, and they would have to have, you know, in a lot of cases, like, some introspection into the system. So I agree that sort of the niche in which, you know, resource consumption vulnerabilities are useful is small. Like you'd basically have to be, you know, trying to grief a large, you know, system and usually have the source code to it, unless you're just hitting it with like very, you know, already super mitigated, you know, sin floods or something. And so I'm in two minds about it, because I think that there are some really interesting memory consumption or just generally resource consumption vulnerabilities out there that are unexplored. But I also think that, you know, this also includes all the boring ones like Loic and stuff like that. So I'm going to put this in the B tier because I think it deserves better. Only got a few left now. Missing authentication for critical consumption, which I've just put in. Where am I getting this from? It's very late, and I don't know why I'm recording this. Missing, or I just put it as missing auth n. And there's a separate missing auth z because for some reason there's a CWE 306 for missing authentication and CWE 862 for missing authorization. I think missing authentication completely is just garbage, just D tier. I don't even know why that's like I mean, obviously it's a thing, right? Because it's like one of those vulnerabilities that's very common in, you know, certain types of, you know, off-the-shelf software that's been built without threat modeling and without a security team. But I just think it's very boring from a technical standpoint. I will never be excited about missing authentication. Same way I will never be excited about missing authorization. I've never read an interesting vulnerability that was about missing authorization. And there's a couple of vulnerabilities here which I guess I've just accidentally skipped over. CWE 611, improper restriction of XML external entity reference. That's the one where you send an XML file and the XML file says, oh, load this thing off some other server, or like, hey, this query for, you know, 100 users in usernames should also include the file etc/password, which could potentially include some password information. I think that's a funny vulnerability, and I think that it still deserves attention, even if it should have died out a long time ago, because it reminds us of the hubris of the sort of Java SOAP era of engineering in general, where you're just like, ooh, I'm going to massively overspec this technology so that it can do absolutely everything. We're going to have schemas, we're going to have includes, we're going to have everything, right? You're going to be able to program your entire fucking system in XML. And I think that was dumb, and not just because I hate how much typing I have to do with anything around those technologies, but also maybe partially a lot because of that. Hard-coded credentials, I think that's an interesting vulnerability that sort of like, I think it needs more. I think it is going to become more mitigated outside of like that core of Silicon Valley companies that can afford to hire security engineers and think about that problem in general. And I think it is an underappreciated problem. It is very easy to buy source code for leaked companies' leaked companies' software on the black market, and, you know, potentially just abuse those hard-coded credentials for things. And of course, there's that massive bug bounty market for just employee credentials that have been uploaded to GitHub. So that is going to be very surprisingly in the A tier. Then there is untrusted deserialization. I think this bug is, quote me on this, fucking stupid, because in general, I think that the idea of serialization systems as sort of like, I want to transmit, you know, the sort of exact series of in-memory constructs that I have in Python, you know, with pickle or with Go gob or with, you know, Java serializable is an incredibly stupid idea in general, because it just like It tries to imagine other systems as an extension of the running program, much like RPC. I hate the concept of remote procedure call. The idea that you think of like a transition between two systems as just calling a procedure, you know, I think it's terrible from a security aspect, and I think it's a bad way of framing the problem in general. Serialization and deserialization should never involve being able to invoke or otherwise, you know, produce Turing complete functionality within the memory of a program. A serialization and deserialization protocol should be as simple as possible, a representation of some ideally map-like but potentially structured like protobuf data. And so that is a solid D tier. Thanks for watching. I hope this was useful in understanding how I feel about information security.